Subscribe to Max Studios on YouTube. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to The Rundown, a show of reflective conversations about faith, culture, and the latest news. And I'm here today with two awesome people who I absolutely love, David and Kathi Peters. They are documentary filmmakers with Global Story Films, and they are owners, operators, founders, creators, they're it. And so thank you both so much for joining me today.
It's our pleasure. Yeah.
And today we're going to talk about your documentary that you did on St. Patrick. It's St. Patrick Pilgrimage to Peace.
Well, we were contracted to produce the film by a company that we've done a lot of work for, Vision Video. So it wasn't our idea to do this, but once we were asked to do it, it totally became like part of us because we were so fascinated by this person as we began to know him, and then to realize how little we and others know about St. Patrick.
And a couple of reasons why I was really intrigued with this project is, number one, we had been in Ireland the previous year to when we knew we would be doing our filming, and we just absolutely fell in love with the country, every aspect of it. And of course, I'm sure everybody that's listening knows of at least one person that would say being in Ireland was my favorite vacation ever. So it was on my bucket list. So getting a chance to go back was just unbelievable. But secondly, the idea that again, I knew very little about him in terms of the whole backstory of his life, and to create a documentary that was not just a regurgitation of what people already knew, but the fact that we were going to be exposing them to information that they had never heard before, that was really intriguing from me personally.
Yeah, and I think y'all did that really well, even with your choices in who you interviewed and the different shots that you got, the landscapes. I mean, it was just incredible because you told the story visually so well too. So what parts of that kind of resonated with you and the interviews that you enjoyed? And, we shared a little bit about all the travel things that you had to do. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
We knew that we wanted to interview people in Ireland, and so finding people, how do you find people? So you look for authors, people who are experts on the topic.
I think for me, there's an archaeologist in the film, Michael Gibbons, that we were actually, as Kathi mentioned, there in Ireland on another project. And we were staying in this little town, and I don't recall the name of it offhand, but we asked the innkeeper there if he knew of anyone in town that could talk to us about St. Patrick from a historical perspective. And he looked at us like, well, yeah, he lives right around the corner. He's like for 30 years has been a leading archaeologist. He leads tours. He speaks like all over Europe and even in the United States. And so he gave us his number and we called him, and he said, well, I got about 45 minutes if you want to come over. And so we came over literally around the corner. It was raining, dragging our equipment in, and we sat down and did this fabulous interview. So then a year and a half later, I guess, when we were working on the St. Patrick project, we met him again, and he took us to various archaeological sites where he's been doing digs. And, and he got quite emotional as he was talking about it, because these things, for him, this land, he's so connected to it. And that's another thing is we found with people in Ireland, they have this deep sense of connection, with the land. And that, as we discovered, is really part of Celtic tradition or Celtic Christianity, is a real sense of connection with the earth. And that they would worship, as they would say, in the cathedral of the earth and the sky, and they would gather around the high crosses. And so where Western Christianity was more about coming into large buildings, there it was all about worshiping outside and realizing that this was the greatest cathedral you could be in, and that's God's creation.
And I think you do, even that part of the story, you convey it through those images and through showing all of the different areas in Ireland. And then, the interviews give such breadth to it, right? They really just illuminate that. So especially with someone like St. Patrick, in your film, you touch on the legend a lot. So you bring up those elements of how this is who he really was. This is what we know. And here's all the things that are out there about him that are still speculated on and are interesting. So what to you were some of the more interesting elements of St. Patrick's legend that you think might resonate with people?
Well, I think, so basically there was about a 200-year period where everything about St. Patrick went totally silent. And then hagiography is basically people kind of in a sense, making up what they think actually happened with him.
Yeah, they would call it a mythological history or a venerative history about a particular character. So it wasn't necessarily meant to be exactly accurate, but it was to venerate them. And so they kind of created, we hear the man, the myth, the legend. In a sense, that's what they did. So instead of being this slave and then this missionary, he becomes this person that has these supernatural powers. And so that was a really fun part of it, and a really eye-opening part was to learn about all of the legends of St. Patrick. There's a certain mountain where if you look at it in a certain part of the day, it looks like there's kind of a cleft in the middle. And of course, he was responsible for that. And one thing that we tell in the director's cut, which didn't actually make it into the original documentary that was released, was the story of one of these sea stacks. And there's a whole legend around that he was having this interaction with this god, and he used his staff, and all of a sudden a piece of the cliff went out into the sea. And so those things were really, really interesting. And of course, the people of Ireland, like in the very beginning, we just did some man on the street interviews, and a lot of the young people, we asked them, what does St. Patrick mean to you? And of course, it's green beer and having a party and being able to dance in the middle of the street and a parade and all that. But some of the people that knew more about him, it's almost always they go to the hagiography, to the legends about him. So some to the exclusion of knowing anything about his being brought to Ireland as a slave as a young boy. So that was fascinating to learn about the myths about, and maybe, I don't know, maybe he did have some. We know the disciples had the ability given to them by Jesus to do miracles. So maybe he did. Who's to say? Yeah.
But, the beauty of, I think, what you do in your documentary too, is that you do play up the legend, who he is to the Irish, but also the very practical parts of St. Patrick in his peacemaking, and how he was innately a peacemaker, and he knew how to have meaningful relationships built on peace.
So when he came, again, there was no military presence. He came as a vulnerable man that felt called by God to bring the gospel to these people that had enslaved him. So just that alone, that he was willing to go back to people that had abused him and left him, for months he would be up with the sheep, and it was just a horrible experience for him, and felt called back. So basically what he did is he went to some of the slaves that he knew, evidently, and some of this is projected or assumed, but he went back to the slave community. And of course, the gospel was very appealing to people in the slave community because it gave them dignity, that they were loved by God and had a place and purpose and were seen as no different from anyone else. So slaves and women were very drawn to the message that St. Patrick brought. So then through those relationships, he was able to connect with the kings, or what were called high kings at that time. They assumed there was about 150 of these small little kingdoms. So he just went to the first one and developed a relationship, again, vulnerably, because the Druids, they had their religious system, and all of a sudden someone's coming in with something new. And so he knew how to come alongside. Like he dressed like the Druids wore white gowns, so he wore a white gown. He would take some of their symbols and even the wells where they would worship. Well, he used those as a place to baptize. So he didn't come in with this notion that you have it all wrong and I've got it right. He blended some of the symbols and redeemed them and saw them somewhat similar to what we would see in the Old Testament pointing to the New Testament, that they were pointing to something else.
One thing that we try as often as we can in a documentary like this is to, just as a pastor will take a biblical passage that he's preaching or teaching on and try to say, okay, so how does this apply to your life? So obviously the Troubles in their fullness in Ireland it's just been a terrible time in their country's history. But a lot of the animosity between political parties and Catholics and Protestants still remains, as we obviously talk about in the film. But how can we, keeping in mind what David just said, how can we, in knowing that there are differences, really seek to understand what those differences are and yet choose to have peace with the person that we think or believe certain things about? How can we keep that peace? Yeah. How can we be peacemakers even more than peacekeepers? So we do tell the story of the Troubles and interviewed some people who continue to do healing work there in Northern Ireland. And it's never totally gone away. So we just felt that it was really important that we bring that into the 21st century, that as he came in peace to the country all those centuries ago, it's hopefully the seed that he planted for peace is being realized today, and that the people of God have a mandate really to be peacemakers in whatever capacity, wherever we've been planted.
Yeah. And when you say, even in thinking about it, that's sort of a theme in a lot of your films, right? That reconciliation and peacekeeping. And, how do you think as Christian documentary filmmakers that is so integral to your message or what you're trying to convey through every film is like kind of the thread that holds them all together?
Well, I mean, if that wasn't the message of Jesus, that we are to love each other and that through our love, the world will see that we are of God. And part of that, if you are loving, then you will be at peace with your fellow man. And the film that we just created and released in a streaming premiere here in worldwide actually, is called Postcards from Babylon, the Church in American Exile. And it deals with Christian nationalism and how we as really the evangelical church have not been people of peace, and how we feel that it's damaged our witness for Christ. So I think we as a church, really worldwide, need to reconsider how we posture ourselves in the world, so that when people that are looking to us to determine, okay, what is this Christianity thing all about? If they don't see love and peace in us and in the way we handle ourselves, then they often will say, I don't want any part of that. You're no different than anybody else.
The gospel is really about a global restoration of peace and a bringing back of shalom, which is peace at all level, not just the absence of war. And really, we interviewed Robin Ames, who used to be the head, basically, of the Church of Ireland. But yeah, I mean, his whole role was entering into the violence. And he said, our churches we were like hospitals and ambulance services, and we would help anyone on both sides. And so the church entered into the fray, again, vulnerably, to try to bring peace.
And to sit and interview these people who their calling is to be messengers of peace and reconciliation, it makes me emotional just even thinking about it. It was really hard as I sat eyeball to eyeball with them and interviewed them, and hearing the passion and the compassion in their words and in their voices, it's beautiful. And that's what we're called to be. And it's tough. It's tough to be a peacemaker because it's easier just to stick with our side and be comfortable. Mm-hmm. Peace and reconciliation is hard work, but yet it's beautiful. And we need to be hearing these voices. And for us, it's just a privilege to be able to bring these messages, which we believe are the heart of God.
This has been awesome. I'm so happy to have had this conversation with you. I love you guys. I love talking to you. And I think your lives are super fascinating. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, we love you too, Bridget. Thank you so much for having me.